coming out to the University of Arizona Debate Series first event, and tonight's event is going to be on immigration, but before we get into that, I would like to introduce our very lovely speakers tonight. So first, we have Shefali Desai, and she's an attorney, speaker, and author who supervises, teaches, and mentors students in regards to workers' rights cases. She litigates and advocates on behalf of gender-based asylum claimants and conducts research pursuant to sanctuary city matters for the benefit of state and local officials. She was elected shareholder at the DeConnick McDonald Law Firm and is now the director of Workers' Rights Clinic here at the university's James E. Rogers College of Law. Next, we have Dorian Edgar-Cito, who earned her BA in Geography and Latin American Studies from Vassar College. She then worked in a variety of roles on the children's, adults, and outreach teams at the Florence Project. Dorian obtained her JD from the City University of New York School of Law, where she interned with Brooklyn Defender Services Immigration Unit, the ACLU Immigrant Rights Project, and the Immigrant Defense Project. She also volunteered with the National Lawyers Guild Parole Preparation Project, assisted CUNY undergraduates in retaining their public benefits with the Economic Justice Project, and worked with the Immigrant and Non-Citizen Rights Clinic and creating Law Enforcement Accountability and Responsibility Project. And our final speaker is Representative Sally Ann Gonzalez, who was born in Brawley, California, and raised in the Yaqui community of Guadalupe, Arizona, with her 10 sisters and brothers. She is married to longtime Pascua Yaqui tribal councilman Luis Gonzalez, with whom she has 5 daughters and 22 grandchildren. Sally holds a BA in elementary education from Arizona State University and a master's in multicultural education from the U of A. In 1922, she was elected to the Pascua Yaqui Tribal Council. It says 77. 1977? Okay, sorry about that. 1977, she was elected to the Pascua Yaqui Tribal Council and served until 1996 when she was elected to the Arizona House of Representatives. And our moderator for tonight's debate is going to be our Executive Director, Ted McLeod.
Just a few things that we want to make sure that everyone knows before we get started today, just about what this series is. Vincent told you all this is the first meeting of this year. It's actually the first ever of this kind. We just began this series, so welcome all to the first ever inaugural U of A Debate Series event. So thank you very much for coming. Give yourselves a round of applause for coming. A few things that are really, really important for everyone to know. Because we're getting off the ground, we want to make sure that we draw attention to these really, really important issues. First of all, our incredible interns are over here, and they have set all of this up. And one of the reasons why we have these public events is we want to be able to send our interns to debate tournaments and to be able to go and raise awareness for all of these issues that we're doing. Some of which this semester, if you guys would like to show up. We're doing on October 5th, we'll be hosting an event on the right to information for journalists and whether it is appropriate for the government to ask journalists to give over their sources, which is pretty relevant considering recent times. We'll have a talk on voting rights a week before the midterm elections on October 27th with Santa Clara University coming to visit us for that. And on November 9th, I believe, right? We'll have a talk on political correctness. And its anthropological, and its linguistic, and its practical implications. So it would be great if everybody could show up to those things, and you can get more information by going to our website, by following us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at UA Debate Series. And we would just love to see everybody there, and the more people that come, the better we are. And if you really, really feel awesome and generous, and you love what we do tonight, you can donate by clicking on our donate button on our website. Anything? Am I good, Smith? Great. Okay, well, thank you very much to all of our speakers, and we're going to go ahead and get started now. How this is going to work is we'll have our speakers deliver some opening remarks afterwards. I'll ask them a few questions based on what they have to say, and we'll have a nice conversation. And then the audience you guys can ask some questions if our speakers are okay with that. and we should be going for a little bit. We'll start right now. And Shefali, you want to begin? Sure. All right, thank you very much. Give a big hand for Shefali.
Hi there, thanks for being here tonight. So I want to give a little bit of a historical perspective first, and I'm going to not be able to give a detailed one because I only have about 5 minutes. So this is an overview, but there are a lot of things that I'm skipping and leaving out. So people have been crossing back and forth over what is now our southern border for millennia, right? Long before there was a border. There are people who, the Tohono O'odham, for example, have traditionally lived on both sides of the border and continue to this day to go back and forth because they have family who live on both sides. In 1854, there was the Gadsden Purchase, which created the border, basically. But even then, people continued to flow freely back and forth. And they did that for several reasons. One being, again, that they had family and people that they wanted to see and be with on both sides. And the other reason was economic. For a long time, people would come over to one side of the border, our side of the border, to work for the day, and then they'd go back. I mean, this happened routinely along the Texas border, also a little bit in the Arizona border. People would come here, work for the day, and then they'd go back home on the Mexican side of the border. And sometimes they'd come, they were seasonal migrant workers, and they'd come for a season, and then they would go back. Then in the 1980s, the United States funded and backed a series of totalitarian and repressive regimes that were trying to put down uprisings that were mostly worker-led uprisings, people who were agitating for justice and fair wages or living wages, better conditions for their families, for living. And by funding these regimes, what we did is we helped enable massive persecution of lots of people from Central America. So then we started to see an influx of folks coming to our southern border from Central American countries. In the 1990s, partly in response to this new wave of people coming, we started to militarize the border. Because one of the thinking at the time was, by doing this, people would stop trying to come through. Well, that didn't happen, and in fact, there are memos and letters that were written during the Clinton administration when some of this was going on, stating that our intent was deterrence, but it's actually not bearing out. And in fact, what we started to see were enormously huge rising death tolls in the desert. And now this is pretty well known and documented. The other result was that economic migrants who before would come for a day or a period of time and then go back, couldn't go back. So if they did manage to get over, they had to stay, because if they went back to be with family, and oftentimes they would leave family members on the other side, they knew they couldn't come back here. So today, the fallout from many of these intended deterrent policies have been a rising death toll, an increasingly lucrative smuggling, human smuggling and trafficking business for the organizations, the organized crime that's involved for that piece of it, and also long lines of asylum seekers at ports of entry. So there are plenty of folks who are trying to come in the way they're supposed to through the ports of entry, and it actually is happening right now at the Mariposa Port of Entry in Nogales, where you will see just women, children, everyone just sitting on the sidewalk, waiting days, sometimes weeks, for their chance at making a claim for asylum. So the current immigration policy, law and policy that we have in this country is woefully inadequate to address this crisis that we're basically having. And I've spoken with and read many stories of asylum seekers in particular who say, look, I had no choice. If I hadn't left, my children would have been killed, I would have been killed, another family member would have experienced torture and other forms of persecution. I had no choice. And so the question really for a lot of these folks is not whether or not they might eventually be able to seek asylum here, it's that they couldn't stay where they were at. We know conclusively now that militarizing the border did not deter people from coming. In fact, people have come in larger numbers. The same is true for detention, by the way. Family detention and separation of children has been in the public eye. And one of the reasons that's put forth for putting people in detention centers instead of releasing them once they come here pending the outcomes of their cases is that it will deter more people from coming. That's actually not true, and the government has never, ever cited a single study that shows that these policies have a deterrent effect. And that has been cited in court case after court case. The other thing is it's illegal under our own laws to say that we're detaining asylum seekers for a deterrent purpose. In other words, we want to keep other people out, so we're going to put you in detention. You're not supposed to do that under both international and US asylum law. So how do we move forward? Because we can't stay stuck at where we're at. I think that's pretty clear now. First of all, there's going to have to be some sort of comprehensive overhaul of our immigration laws and policies. And it has to be grounded in a way that's separate from the deeply racist and colonialist viewpoints based in the inferiority of non-Anglo peoples that gave rise to many of our immigration laws historically, if you look at the history of US immigration law. And for this to happen, we as a country will have to come to terms with our deep distrust of differences and our desire for homogeneity. And this won't be easy. I mean, lots of countries struggle with this and are struggling with it. But the other piece of this is that we have to take a close look at how our immigration courts work. Because right now, immigration courts are not part of the independent judiciary. In other words, they don't operate the way all other courts, Article III courts and also state level courts operate in our country. They're under the executive branch, under the Department of Justice. And so immigration judges, to some degree, might feel like they have to do what the Attorney General is telling them instead of rendering a fair and neutral opinion in each and every case. And that's a big deal. So why should we care about this? I think there are lots of reasons. The first, in my opinion, is a humanitarian one. We have utterly failed to respond to the humanitarian crisis that's happening at our southern border right now. We're locking people up, including children and families, and the government is actually right now attempting to say that they should be able to keep children in detention for longer than 20 days. That's been the standard, and now they're seeking several different avenues to be able to keep children with their parents in detention, potentially indefinitely, until their cases are resolved. Immigrants are good for our economy, and that's something that doesn't get talked about a lot. One of the reasons that led to the militarization of the border in the 90s was there was this idea that immigrants were taking jobs away from Americans. And that's an idea that's been debunked repeatedly in the research for this on this issue. What people don't see, they see immigrants working in jobs. What they don't see is immigrants creating jobs, immigrants buying American products, paying taxes on those products, and being members of our economic community. They very much are. We very much are when we are immigrants and we're here doing that. Immigrants are also far less likely to commit violent crimes than the native-born population. That's something else I think that also gets missed when a particular person who's committed a crime is is kind of held up as an example for an entire community, but that's not true of the immigrant community. And immigrants are also far less likely to use welfare-type benefits than native-born Americans. So at the end of the day, it's naive to think that we can somehow stop immigrants and asylum seekers from coming to our country. And I'll end with this, I really like this quote by a British poet who is of Somali heritage. And the quote is, "You don't leave home unless home is the mouth of a shark." Thank you.
Thank you very much for all the things that you remember. And I'll move on to Jordan.
All right, so my name is Dorian Ediger-Sato. I am a staff attorney at the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project, which is the only nonprofit legal services organization in Arizona to provide free legal services to the nearly 5,000 men, women, and children who are detained for deportation proceedings on any given day in Arizona. So I'm going to speak a little bit to the work that I do and kind of how a bit of what Shefali was talking about really plays out on a daily basis in detention centers and in the lives of people who I see and talk to every day. And this is very much an issue that is in our backyard here in Tucson, and so it's important for everybody to know about. So the Florence Project was actually founded in 1989 in response to the big numbers of people who are fleeing Central America because of US-funded civil wars and asking for asylum. And so that kind of influx of people resulted in the immigration courts and detention centers having a bunch of people who had never been in court before, who were navigating extremely complicated asylum laws, who really had no idea what was happening. And the thing about all of that is that if you're in deportation proceedings, there's no right to a public defender. So if you're charged with a crime, you don't have any money to pay a lawyer, you go to court and somebody is assigned to represent you, and that is like a right under the Constitution. Immigration proceedings is not like that. And so people who are going through deportation proceedings, oftentimes from detention centers, which look and act and smell and function like prisons, and are actually often run by the same private prison companies that have contracts to hold long-term prisoners who have been accused of crimes and are serving their sentences. People are going through that process from detention, maybe never having spoken to a judge, never having gone to law school, never having opened an immigration law book, and are expected to speak for themselves and advocate for themselves without the benefit of a lawyer if they don't have money to do that. So about 86% of people who are in detention in Arizona going through that process don't have an attorney. So the Florence Project, at the Florence Project, we help those people. And so we have about 70 staff to assist about 5,000 people on any given day. And so to give you a sense of the scope, in 2017 we served almost 8,000 men, women, and children with our 70 staff. They were from 96 different countries and they spoke 81 languages. And so that's a lot of people and not very many attorneys or legal assistants, right? So how do we do that? We don't actually represent people. So because we have very few resources, because there's no state funding or federal funding for a public defender system, in this process, we teach people how to represent themselves. So we'll talk to people, we'll explain what their rights are, we'll explain what immigration court looks like, and then we'll figure out what their options are, what kinds of documents they're going to need to convince the judge that they should get out of detention on bond, or that they should be allowed to stay in the US, and then how they're going to sit in front of a judge alone and explain to the judge why they shouldn't have to go back to their country. Maybe because they're fleeing extreme persecution, maybe because their whole life is here. So that's what my organization does. I'm a staff attorney there, and I actually work in the very small unit. There's a very, very small number of people that because of a federal lawsuit are entitled to free representation because they're incompetent, because they have significant mental health issues. And so people who are severely mentally ill and severely mentally disabled, sometimes an immigration judge will kind of look at their case and say, okay, your constitutional rights and the protections that federal law hold for people with disabilities mean that you really need an attorney in this situation, and so to preserve your rights, we're going to assign somebody. So I used to work with folks teaching them how to fight their own cases, but I actually now currently represent people as appointed counsel. So 5 minutes is not that long. So that's my job, and that's kind of where I'm coming from. And when you talk about immigration, there's a lot of stuff, right? And it's been in the news every single day in the past year, far more than it ever was before. So I'm really going to talk about kind of how that all plays out in detention and in deportation proceedings. So Shefali was talking about a series of reforms to the immigration laws that happened kind of in the 90s. So there was a big, big change. The last big immigration reform that happened was in 1996. there were two laws, IRA, and EDPA. I do not remember what they stand for, but they're both very bad. And they did a couple of things to the current system. They established more criminal bars to immigration. So for example, if you have a green card, a lot of people don't know that you can still be deported if you commit certain crimes. That could be something as little as having 2 convictions for simple possession of marijuana. So you get arrested for having a joint twice, you can be put into deportation proceedings. And you're actually not eligible to get out of detention while you're fighting that case. So that was the other thing, is that this law established mandatory detention. So it said, okay, you could be fighting a case outside of detention, right? Living in a community, kind of living your life while a judge is going through the process, or you could be locked up in this prison. So we're going to increase the number of people who under the law, judges don't have discretion to let out of detention. So that's a lot of people in detention, including people with almost any criminal conviction, and also anybody who arrives at a port of entry asking for asylum. So those folks are locked up for the duration, and that's because of this 1996 law. The other thing that it did is it kind of restricted, it added more bars, so it made it easier for the government to deport people who had been living here without status, and it also made it much more difficult for people who had spent any time in the US without papers to adjust their status and to become permanent residents and to kind of get in line to go through the system. It just kind of, it made the line non-existent. And so kind of overall what these laws did is they took a lot of discretion out of the hands of immigration judges. So even if a judge looks at you and says, oh my God, you have the most sympathetic case in the world, like you're super sad, your kid has cancer, you were caught with a joint, this is all terrible, you should definitely be allowed to stay. Or you've been in the United States since you were literally 3 weeks old, one of my clients. But yet because of how your life has played out, I'm actually not even allowed under the law to give you a chance or to give you a day in court to decide if it makes sense to deport you. I don't have no discretion. So that's what happened in 1996, and that really is what set the stage for the current situation, where we have an increasing number of people in detention, an increasing number of people who don't qualify for relief, and a political situation where like this administration has been actively restricting the ability of people to qualify for things like asylum. They've changed the definition of what asylum is for many people. So right now we're really taking a law that took a lot of discretion away from the judges and making it even more difficult for them to kind of consider the individual merits of somebody's case and to give them a fair day in court. So that's kind of where we are. And I think, I think all of this comes down to the fact that I did not do debate club, so I talk with my hands. The fundamental problem of immigration law and policy as it is written and also as it's enacted every day is that the reality of people's lives, the reality of the US's role in the world and the things that we've done to really mess with other countries' ability to create sustainable futures for their people, and our own economic needs in this country, all of that reality has very little to do with how the immigration laws are written. So there's like the reality, and then there's kind of these boxes that immigration law has manufactured to address that reality, but it has nothing to do with anything. And so I think that's any kind of changes to the system are going to need to recognize that people's lives are messy and they're complicated, and people make mistakes, and that maybe they should still have a chance for a fair day in court, and they should still have a chance to build a future and to make a life for themselves and for their kids, and be treated with some human decency and kindness. So, do I have more time, or is that fine?
You probably have another minute.
Yeah. So that's kind of the fundamental problem. I think in terms of figuring out where to go from here, I'm sure that somebody will have a question about that, so I'll answer more later. But I think really thinking about how immigration judges who are making these decisions, can first of all be educated on like basic cross-cultural competency, because there's like a lot of misinformation out there, but also can be given some independence, so they're not being directed by the executive branch, right? They're made part of the judiciary, right? We have 3 branches of government: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. ICE and the Border Patrol and all of the immigration enforcement agencies are under the executive, and so are the immigration courts. And so you have the same branch of government making all the decisions about if somebody should be able to stay in the U.S. as the agency that's trying to kick them out. So that is kind of setting up everybody for failure, honestly, kind of no matter where you end up in the system, and no matter what you think of it. And I think it really undermines like the basic democratic principles that this country is founded on, that there should be checks and balances, and that there shouldn't be kind of a whole system that's solely guided by one branch of the government. That in a democracy we should be able to be accountable in various different ways. So.
Thank you, and
Thank you. I first would like to thank all of you for being here for this very important discussion. And the ladies who are the experts on dealing with the families and the children that are being detained. And so I thank you both for being here and to add to this discussion. I'm actually here replacing somebody, but immigration is, I decided to come at the last minute because immigration is a very important issue to me as an indigenous woman, as a member of the Pascua Yaqui tribe. We too have people on both sides of the border. But my people live 500 miles from here, so just south of San Carlos and Guaymas, and between Guaymas and Ciudad Obregón is the Yaqui territory. But we are a federally recognized tribe. As a matter of fact, this week we are celebrating 40 years of federal recognition, but we have been here time immemorial, and that's why we were able to get federal recognition. But lots of people confuse us as being Mexican, and partly a lot of people confuse nationality with ethnicity, and Yaquis, can be Mexicans, but it's nationality and not ethnicity. We are one of the Sonoran tribes in Sonora, Mexico, and I actually live on the reservation, just 12 miles from here, southwest of here, and it's interesting to hear some of the dates of the immigration issue, because in 1990, somebody was introducing me and said 1926. Well, to me that is significant, because that's the year my mom was born, and this past week she just turned 92. But in 1996, I was first elected to the state legislature, and becoming the first Native American woman to ever hold a seat at the state legislature in Arizona. And I served for 4 years back to 24 years ago, and then ran for the Senate and lost, and then I stayed out in the politics, because I'm not really a politician, I'm a policymaker, and I'm really an educator by profession, and I was teaching at Lawrence Elementary, where the children off of the reservation attend. So my children were there attending, and I was a teacher there, and it was the lack of cooperation, the lack of support, and the lack of support for not only I as a teacher, but as a mom, and also for my children who were attending. And at that time, Lawrence Elementary had almost 1,000 children, and 75% of them were Yaqui children from coming off of the reservation. So to me that was really important, and that's what really catapulted myself into politics. And in 1992 I decided to run for tribal council in order to give me some support in working with TOSD and asking them for a better education for all our children. And I got elected, served for 4 years, and in those 4 years I learned a lot about the lack of representation that Native people have in the state government, in county government, and so in '96, when I was ending my 4-year term at the tribe, there was an opening at the House of Representatives in my district. I was encouraged to run. I ran, no name ID, nothing, behind me, and I was lucky to get elected back in '96. And I was out for 10 years, and it was in 2010, 8 years ago, when the legislature did 1070, the really, really bad immigration law that really affected all of us, not just the immigrants, all of the brown people that look like me in in Arizona, and especially in southern Arizona, because I have to tell you that all of my life I've been discriminated against because of how I look and the color of my skin. And immigration, because we have people across the family, across the border, we went and we come all the time. And we were always stopped and we were always checked. And because we have a big family, we drove a van. And so they always stopped us. And I always was wondering why the car in front of us didn't get stopped and why the car behind us didn't get stopped. But we always did because of how we looked and because of what we were driving and the amount of people in our car. And so this law to me was really detrimental and that's the reason I was sent back to the legislature. I ran and I was lucky to get elected, and here I am 8 years later, finishing out my 8-year terms in the House of Representatives. And my role, I'm a Democrat, and so I sit in the majority as a majority member, a minority within the minority at the state legislature, and it's been really difficult, but I love my work. I think I lend a voice to the immigrant people that are coming here, to people of color that live in Arizona, poor people, teachers and students. Anyway, my point is that my role, I have not had any legislation passed because my legislation is really controversial. I want to appeal what's left of 1070. I want to repeal the ban against Mexican studies that was put into place during that year too in TOSD because of the fear of the immigration, especially the Mexican immigration coming into this country from our southern border. And it is the fear of the unknown that I've been dealing with since I've been up at the legislature since 1997. It really happened back then when my colleagues started to look at the numbers and says, the Mexican Americans are having babies. They are, they had predicted by 2030 they would become the minority in this country. And so my colleagues that are in power decided to start reacting to that. And so back then they got rid of bilingual education. I am a bilingual teacher. And they thought, like some of the comments that were made here, that if they, did change the border, militarize the border, that they would stop coming. Well, they thought that if they took away the education of their children, that they would stop coming. That if we stop English-only laws, that if we demanded that they speak English, that they would stop coming. But that didn't happen because of what the lady said. If we have to put ourselves in their place. Who of us would leave our country, our family, our homes, our everything to come to an unknown, crossing across deserts for thousands of miles sometimes, if they're coming from Central and South America, to a situation of where we have now, where they're being detained at the border and they're being separated from their, their children. Who would come that? Only because their lives is so bad, would they put themselves in this. And so my role at the legislature is to educate my colleagues. This is what you're doing when you propose and you pass these laws, anti-immigration laws, as deterrents from coming to the U.S. And so that's what we do. And as a member of the Native American Caucus, we do the same thing. We are only four of us. Three of my indigenous colleagues are Navajos. I'm the only one from Southern Arizona and the only one that is not Navajo. And we certainly need more indigenous people. I strongly believe that we need people at the legislature and in Congress that look like this country, like the audience looks in here. And that's why I run. But, really, the Yaqui people go back and forth. And it's important that the borders remain open, that we don't close up, it's like cutting our nose and spite our face, because, to the Yaquis, we have family, to go to, and they have, last night there was a funeral. There was people from Mexico. There has to be open borders so that our people and our relatives can go back and forth, because that is a way of life. This is family. It is not about coming here and taking. So we really, it's important. We, the Yaquis, have a tribal card that allows us to go back and forth, but our members that live in Mexico don't have a card to make it easier for them to come here and then return. And so it really makes life difficult for us in our community, culturally and religiously. And so those are the things that are important to remember, that indigenous people across the border from Texas to California, we didn't cross the border crossed us, and we need to consider their historical status and their cultural and religious status as well when we talk about the borders. But the humanization of the children that are coming here, the families that are coming here, are just as important to me and should be to all of us, because there is no one that is an alien or that is illegal as far as I'm concerned. And so we need to really talk and dialogue, and I'm glad you're all here, and hopefully that wherever you're at, that you take what we're saying tonight and spread the word, because we need help. For those of us who are talking immigration 24/7, we need help for other people to hear what is important about the immigration issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So one thing that I'm hearing a sort of theme over and over again, and this surely shouldn't be surprising, but it's striking me that the humanization of the issue is something that just so rarely gets spoken about, especially when we're arguing about it in the political sphere. From Sadian's own comments about personal stories to Dorian's suggestion that we need to make sure that we're treating people with dignity and that we recognize the actual situations and statuses that people are in. To Shefali's history of people who were going back and forth with, and that it wasn't an issue. So I want to talk a little bit about the sort of human aspect being taken out of it. But before I do, one question that really strikes me that both of you guys talked about: why does the executive branch oversee all of these issues instead of the judicial branch? That seems strange to me. But is there?
So this is a much broader question. Here, I'm gonna just, this is a much, is this working?
It's fine. It's fine.
If you can all hear me, okay, all right. So, this is a broader question. But I think what your question goes to is executive power. So the US Constitution, I had a law professor in law school who's still here at the law school, and she's excellent. And she used to say the Constitution is a hanky. Like, it's really hanky. Have you ever read it? And you should all go back home tonight and read the Constitution, because it's not that long. And it doesn't really say all that much. And that's why we have courts, right? Because they do a lot of the interpretation of who has what power. But you all know, I'm sure, that a fundamental aspect of American democracy is separation of powers. So we have three branches. We have the executive, president, and all the administrative agencies that flow from it, including the Department of Justice and all the immigration apparatus that we have in this country, and the Department of Homeland Security. And then we have the legislative branch, Congress, and then we have the judiciary. The executive branch gets the national, to the extent that it's at all mentioned, it gets the national security power. And so what the executive has done historically has invoked its power under national security, its need to ensure secure borders in order to pass and enforce immigration measures. And you see this over and over again. We saw this with Japanese internment camps during World War II. Then after 9/11, we also saw a big shift, and that was again, in national security invocations. And I think you're seeing it now when we have these statements that we have to keep people out or put them in detention because we're going to have increased crime or there are criminal elements, and sifting through how much of that is actually occurring and how much of that is so that we can expand the power of the executive in this area is sometimes difficult to parse out. A very good example of this, having played out very recently, is the travel ban case, popularly known as the travel ban case. It was the Hawaii case, and it's the case the Supreme Court decided last term. And in that case, that is the power that the court ultimately relies on to let the executive branch basically discriminate on the basis of religion, because that is what that ban initially was. It was saying that people of a certain religion from certain countries couldn't come into the United States, which is protected by the First Amendment, and yet the court said, we're going to let the executive do this. And the case was more complicated than that, but anyway, does that begin to answer your question?
It does. Yeah, Dorian, please. Yeah.
Well, I have something to add, I guess, then maybe you can clarify, because we can get really confused about this. So just to clarify, the executive branch has kind of power over foreign affairs and national security. I think in the Constitution it's actually about foreign policy. That's the actual language. It's not about homeland security. That's a more modern invention. But it is. But Congress has the power to create rules about naturalization, which means that Congress has the power to pass the actual immigration statutes that the executive branch then interprets because of this other power to kind of regulate foreign affairs. So Congress does. So it's not like any given presidential administration can just decide that they're going to have a different immigration law. That all has to go through Congress, which is part of why we're in this mess, right? Because Congress cannot agree on what immigration reform looks like. But I think the other thing to add is because of that executive branch power to kind of dictate foreign policy and national security, the travel ban case allowed the government to do that on the basis of religion, but all of the cases that were cited in that case, and all of the kind of big fundamental principles of how power is allocated to the president, and the limits of that power, the fact that there are no limits, all of that actually comes from a line of cases that were developed to justify the Chinese Exclusion Act. So when we talk about religion, we're also in this field very much talking about race. And so I would just kind of add that little wrinkle, I guess.
Thank you. So I have one question that I want to make sure that includes that in it as well, because I know Sarah has to leave soon. But just off of that, and I know this is kind of like a sort of heady philosophical question when it comes to this, but especially because Diane, you're a representative, and based on what you guys just said, the White House wouldn't make these determinations unless they thought that they were going to be in some way popular with constituents. And so I'm curious as to, especially because then you said you feel like part of your job is to sort of educate the other people who are with you in government. So I'm wondering if you feel as though this general sense of anxiety about, immigrants going to take American jobs and things like that, do you feel like that's coming from the bottom up or the top down? Do you feel as though the government and the White House is sort of convincing constituents and the populace that is the case, or do you feel that is coming from a sense of unease in the populace that politicians are responding to? Does that make sense? Is that I know that's.
I guess I would, and like to respond, and I apologize that I will have to leave soon. But I think it's a little bit of both. Like I mentioned earlier, I have been dealing for 24 years about immigration and the laws changing in Arizona because my colleagues that are in power have been wanting to change, to deter people from coming and to stop people from coming. It is, an opinion that has been playing for many, many years, and now with the current administration, it only has been exemplified as to in a really negative way, because we have had immigration. When you talk to indigenous people, everybody except people that are indigenous to this country are in some way immigrants and come from immigrant families. And so, we need to all of us consider, those of us that are not indigenous to consider that and to think about that. And indigenous people, for the most part, welcome people here at the very beginning. And unfortunately, the historical thing that had happened with indigenous people here by the taking of the land bank, the government, the settlers coming in and killing and taking the land, and then the government, as it was built, what's the word? Implementing genocide on indigenous people. That happened to us in Mexico too. So we Yaquis have had a double whammy, not only in our country of origin, but also here. In origin it's like to us, we're Americans. We are Americans because there was no border here, and a lot of the people that are coming over the border now look like me. They're very much indigenous people that are being ousted from their communities, that are being sent away. Probably in some realm is because in their country, in their communities, people, drug cartels and people in power also are trying to push them out of their land, historical land, and they're being killed. They are, and so. That's all that I will say, because it's really a strong sentiment to me that we treat any person with less dignity of a human being just because they're coming from another country. And so that's an issue that we need to talk about and deal with if what's happening now at our borders is going to stop. But I thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
I'm going to leave a couple of cards, and I'm sure that all of you students are very well know how to research and find me online at the state legislature. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to have a further conversation on this topic with any one of you. Thank you very much.
John. So just to continue the discussion, in about 5 minutes we'll take questions from the audience, as was promised, and I'll be able to not have to sit up here in my seersucker suit talking about this stuff. But going back to it, I mean, the reason why I ask is especially because it sounds, even though this often gets discussed as though it's a right-left thing, it sounds pretty bipartisan in terms of how it is that the government has sort of overstepped their boundaries and kind of bundled this entire issue. I mean, it doesn't sound like, I mean, as you mentioned, Shefali, during the 90s, during the Clinton administration, it doesn't sound as though this was particularly, owned by one party. So that's why I ask whether you feel as though it's politicians sort of convincing their constituents that this is an issue that they should be scared of, or whether this is a general anxiety that politicians are responding to in order to. Does that make sense?
I agree that I think we keep on turning these off by accident. But so I mean I agree. I think it's a little bit of both. I mean if you look at the economic situation, we live in a country that is, I think, as unequal economically as it has ever been. And I think it's very, very easy for people who have deep ties to really, really, really wealthy lobbying groups who are pushing very specific agendas to kind of make to divide like regular working people by making one group of people seem scary or like they don't deserve help. I think that's like it's a very, very convenient strategy, and I think it's such a. I'm not saying that there's like a group of like evil people in a room like conspiring together, though honestly like maybe there is. I wouldn't be invited. But I also think that's just kind of how like society has been structured for a long time, and we've gotten to a place where a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds in a lot of different ways are really hurting. And instead of kind of looking at that and figuring out a way to make life better for all sorts of people, it's very, very easy for private prison companies to be like, hey, I have a solution. Let's just call all of these people dangerous criminals, and then we get to lock them up and make a lot of money. As an example. So I really do think it's both, and I also think I think that a lot of this, I mean, we keep on kind of talking about race, like in a kind of like being like, yes, racism. But I mean, this country has always had a big problem with race and with diversity, and since we've founded, that's not how to have a group of people from all kinds of different walks of life, who maybe are indigenous to this country, who are maybe brought here against their will, how to build a society where all people have an equal voice and all people are kind of treated with the same amount of respect. That's a problem, that's something that we've struggled with, and so I think it's very easy for politicians to kind of whip out talking points, and it's easy to kind of push these issues to the side, but at the end of the day, like all of those things hurt actual people. So I do think it is coming from both.
I think it's also a little bit wishful thinking that if we do, for example, I'm gonna kind of ground my answer in a little bit of a specific example, that if we put people in detention, then we're gonna end this problem. We're not gonna have people going, kind of disappearing on us and not showing up for their court hearings, and we're gonna hopefully deter a whole bunch of other people from coming. But that's actually not how the facts bear out. So I want to use family detention as an example, because that's something that pretty much everyone knows about. It's really in the public eye right now. So families, and this was actually in 2015, the Department of Homeland Security actually started a pilot project of releasing families. They're called family case management programs. And DHS hired a contractor, the families were released, and the contractor said that 99% of the families who were released complied with all of the court orders that they needed to comply with, including the many families who were ultimately deported. So this is just an example of how we want to believe, and maybe politicians find it more expedient to believe, that locking people up, and then there's potentially someone is standing to gain from all of this, want to think that this is the solution, whereas the real solution is a little bit more complicated, maybe requires a little more effort, although the family case management systems cost on average $36 a day for a family of 4. Detention costs upwards of $900 a day for a family of 4. So the people who are really losing out here are the US taxpayers when we don't take a good look at whether or not what we might instinctually think works, when we don't really take a good look at whether or not that's actually bearing out.
And I would add kind of yet another inflammatory headline that's actually true, is that the Department of Homeland Security, which manages both ICE and FEMA, which provides for direct disaster relief for people all over the country of all kinds of different immigration statuses. The DHS, because they wanted to increase detention of families and to separate children from their parents who were crossing the border, they moved billions of dollars from, or maybe millions, I'm not good at math, but they moved a lot of money from FEMA's budget right before hurricane season, which we all know was coming, into the budget of ICE so that they could pay for this. So at the end of the day, that decision to not look at how much all of these different alternatives cost hurts everybody, no matter what you think of that.
Thank you. And I know that another solution that she probably sort of gestured toward in her opening remarks is not even starting with legislation, but also just with changing the minds of American people. So we'll talk about that, which is why it's time for us to get some questions from the audience. So does anybody have questions for any of our speakers up here? Because I have a few more, just to grill these guys with. Yeah, Sean?
Yeah, thanks. I guess this is for either panelists. I just wanted to know, in your opinion, what do you think might be the biggest misperception in the media, whether on the left, right, or center, on immigration today?
That's not a hard question at all. I should probably do something before me earlier, so I guess I will take this one. I think the perception that such a diverse group of people, right, 96 countries, 81 languages, that my organization has served over the past year, of any number of different legal statuses and life situations, that there is any one blanket solution to fix that problem. I think that's the biggest misperception on actually all levels of the political spectrum. I don't think it's a particularly easy fix, and so I think the idea that you can kind of make blanket statements about anybody, that's not how life works, right? We're all unique and special individuals. So.
I think one big misperception may not be the right way to say it, but one thing that I think most people don't talk about is when we're thinking about cracking down on immigration, cracking down on unlawful or undocumented immigration, there's this idea that we're only talking about a certain group of people. But what it actually does is it has ripple effects for all of us. And I'll give you a couple or 2 or 3 examples of that. So Sally talked about SB 1070. Well, part of what SB 1070 does is it erodes constitutional due process rights. So in other words, it in certain circumstances allows police officers to ask questions that they otherwise would have no reason or business to ask. In fact, The local police and sheriffs in many of our counties, including Pima County, have said we don't like having to do this because what it does is it fosters distrust among our communities. And these are not just undocumented communities. First of all, where we live in Tucson and in Arizona in general, there is no such thing as a non-immigrant community. I mean, all of our communities are intertwined. Everybody, and I can't remember what the statistics are, but there's a very large percentage in Pima County of folks who are U.S. citizens or documented immigrants who live with an undocumented immigrant. So whether that's a parent or a cousin or a friend. And so what happens in those communities is people are not reporting crime. Domestic violence rates in immigrant communities in particular, both documented and undocumented, are at extreme low levels. And so when we're cracking down on illegal immigration, what we're really doing is making our communities, all of our communities, a lot less safe. So that's just one example. I could go on, but yeah, I don't want to. Does that answer some of your question?
Thank you.
Okay.
That's helpful, and I think that part of what is helpful about that answer is that it talks about this in such practical terms, which sort of leads to another question that I have, which is, again, kind of a really kind of broader one, but what do you think the best rhetoric to use to convince those who do have that anxiety or who are being sort of misinformed? What do you think that the best way to sort of discuss and convince that segment of the population is by making sure that they understand the sort of the gravity of what's going on by really, really pointing out the extremity of what's happening, or do you think that there's sort of like that middle ground that we're supposed to like move to, or do you think it's the state to move to that middle ground? Because I know Chappelle, you and I have talked a lot about how to sort of like make sure that these two sides hear each other a little bit more, and that sometimes fire rhetoric is useful because it draws attention to a situation, but sometimes it ends up sort of pushing people's backs against the wall. So, especially in the spirit of this whole entire series.
I really think the key is to talk to as many different kind of people as you can talk to. People with experiences that are different from your own, because that's the only way to begin not having a fear of difference. And so, kind of to answer your question, I don't know if that means moving to the middle, but what I do think really does make a difference is narrative and storytelling. So we can talk about these broad, kind of theoretical issues but until you can put a face to the problem or give a specific example of how someone's been affected, I think it's very hard for most people who don't work in this area to grasp what's actually going on. But there has to be a willingness on the part of each individual to want to hear those stories, to expose themselves to other people who either have those stories or work in that area. So I think that's really the answer, is to ground it. I mean, one of the answers is to ground when we're talking about these issues in real life experiences and stories.
I would agree with that, and we're doing a terrible example of modeling that tonight. But I was thinking of I was thinking of if I have any good examples of people I've worked with, and I just can't choose. But I think that one of those things is looking to people's own families. I have family members from kind of all sides of the political spectrum, and with really complicated migration stories. And I found that talking to people about what our own family, what has happened in our own family, how the rules maybe were different when my very, very, very conservative Christian grandfather's parents came here, how they were different, fleeing religious persecution, how they were different then than they are now, right? And kind of linking the fact that maybe we can have very different backgrounds, we can look very different, we can speak different languages, but there are common threads. And I think actually a very powerful example of that is there's a genealogist who was really frustrated by some of the more inflammatory statements about family-based migration that some of the members of the current administration were making. And so she started a Twitter project called Resistance Genealogy, where she does records requests and does kind of genealogical research into the immigration backgrounds of prominent members of the Trump administration. It turns out that immigration is much closer to people's current daily lives than anybody ever would have thought. And so when we're talking about, like, I think individual stories, and I also think, like, never assuming that the person sitting next to you has an experience that is the same as yours.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, I think what I especially appreciate about both of those answers, again, I think that it takes it outside of the political realm, and it's odd to me that this issue has so moved into just that, and that seems to be the only time that we ever really talk about this issue is when it actually is, during an election season, in any really serious substantive way. So. So I'm glad we're having this conversation tonight. I have another question as far as the laws go, but do we have other questions from the audience? Yes, please.
I was just wondering, I think we've kind of brought it up with SB 1070 and other MIS programs in school here, but I feel like, especially since we're on a university campus right now, it's important to acknowledge, like, how important do you feel that the role education plays in this whole issue? Because I know you've talked about proximity and sharing stories, but just in terms of getting acquainted with this information, like, in the classroom, like, how important do you feel that is?
I think it's extremely important because this area is very complicated. I mean, just from the legal standpoint, I'm not even talking about policy right now. Sally's not here to talk to us more about that, and that's super complicated. But the legal arena in immigration and asylum law is one of the most complex areas of the law, even for legal practitioners. And so and this goes back to Ted's last question. It's very hard to generalize about most of these things. So the only way to really grapple with the nuances and the complexities is through education. And unfortunately, the vast majority of people in our country are not educated on this topic. And so they see potentially inflammatory rhetoric in the media, or maybe even it's not inflammatory, it's just kind of a short soundbite, but they don't understand everything that's behind it, they don't understand where it comes from, and they don't have a rubric within which to make sense of it.
Yeah, and I think learning, kind of education directly on the issues, education about the history of this country, and also about world history, right? The U.S. does not exist in a vacuum. And I think a lot of the current issues in talking about immigration that we have, come out of that, I think like a general education system that really treats us as if we're kind of this a kind of unique and the only place in the world, right? I say this, I am from the US, but I actually grew up outside of the US, and so I did not get the same education as most, and I came back here for college, and I had a very different understanding of world history than most of my peers, just because the content of what was taught at my school was so different than what is taught in most public schools here. But it was also in college that I really learned critical thinking, right? To ask questions, to ask why. And so even if people aren't taking classes that speak directly to these issues, I think really kind of questioning the things that you've been taught, what people say in the news is important. And I also want to give a shout out. There's some really amazing resources on campus here that are specifically directed at supporting people from immigrant backgrounds with immigrant family members, students with DACA and who are undocumented. The Immigrant Student Resource Center is a resource center that's specifically there. They also do a lot there to support folks and to help people navigate the really complicated in-state tuition stuff that's been happening at the university. And they also do a lot of work with professors and with TAs about how to kind of talk about these issues in the classroom in a way that doesn't, that kind of creates conversation and possibilities, and also supportive of a lot of students who are actually really directly impacted by this stuff. So very good shout out to them, and if that's a resource that you think would be of use, look them up. And yeah, they're great.
Excellent. We have time for one more question, which I'm happy to ask unless we have something. Great.
So the representative talked about kind of opening the border, bringing in mass migration. A lot of countries in Western Europe have tried it, such as Sweden, Germany, the United Kingdom, and they've been failing with those plans. There's been a lot of turmoil. So why do you think it would work in the U.S.?
So I think that, I don't know if everybody heard, so you asked, the representative had talked about, opening up the borders to like more, mass migration. And that in Europe, many countries have tried that and it hasn't really worked very well, so why do we think it will work here? So I think that you're referring to countries in Europe really responding to refugee crises that have come out of like actual wars in many parts of the country. Different countries have different ways and systems that they handle people's asylum applications and refugee applications. And so I don't know that anybody could say that like any one particular system works really well or really badly. What I do know is that I have a friend, my best friend in the world, lives in Austria, and she has become friends with a number of the folks who are fleeing Syria and Afghanistan and Iran seeking asylum, who are waiting for their asylum applications to be pending. She lives in a very, very, very small farming town, kind of in the middle of Austria. It's kind of like the equivalent to like a small town in Iowa, right? And she's been taught, and it's been interesting to talk to her, kind of to contrast how the two countries have worked their systems. In Austria, when you're waiting for your asylum application, you're not allowed to work, which is the same as here. You can't actually get a work permit when you come here and apply for asylum until you've waited for a certain amount of time to ask for permission to work. And so, which is really hard on people here because there are no social services, you don't get any benefits, you don't get housing, you don't get food while you're waiting for that work permit to come in. In Austria, for example, the government, because they recognize that they're not going to allow people to work, they provide very, very basic like housing and food. And they also do a lot to work with the local residents of the town to make sure that people, first of all, feel like there aren't a bunch of like strange foreigners coming in, and to introduce folks to each other and to make sure that there is a little bit more understanding of where people are coming from and why they're there. And so that actually seems like a very effective model to me. I think it has been a global issue, right? There are increasing numbers of refugees every year. And again, many people flee their countries not because they want to, but because they literally have to. They're choosing between their life or their child's life and their homeland, right? And so I think remembering that context, and the fact is that the number of people who are crossing borders seeking protection has been growing, and it will continue to grow as long as kind of the world doesn't figure out how to deal with conflict in a more healthy way. And so I guess pushing back a little bit on the premise of the question, but that is an example of kind of the difference in the system.
Yeah, it seems as though it's sort of a battle between the humane and the practical, right? And I think that it's usually posed that way, right? And I think that's
And I don't think it necessarily has to be an either or.
right.
Because I think the other underlying issue here is that we should ask why are we seeing such huge numbers of refugees? And that's also a very complicated question. But one of the things that certainly could be simultaneously done, in addition to some of the other recommendations that we've made, is that we can re-engage with the global community to make sure that the places people are fleeing are places people want to stay in. Because no refugee or asylum seeker is going to tell you that they would prefer to leave their home, everything they know, everyone they love. They want to be able to stay in their homes. They just can't. It's life or death in many situations. And so that's the other conversation that is probably not really part of what we're talking about today. But there are other strategies in addition to the immigration strategies that we as a nation should be pursuing, and we have in the past.
And I guess as an example of that, to kind of like bring it back to thinking about this as an issue of many individual people, I have a client right now who is from Iraq, And when the Iraq War broke out, he was in his early 20s, and he decided that he wanted to be an interpreter for the U.S. Army. And so he did that he was in combat, he was in like many ID explosions. He was functionally a member of like several units of the U.S. Army, acting kind of on the front lines of combat. He was shot at twice by insurgent groups who were like pissed at him for working with the U.S. And his family for a couple of years tried to convince him to leave, and he was like, no, I don't want to leave, this is my home, this is my work. I want to kind of see this out, and eventually he was forced to flee because some stuff happened, and he came here as a refugee. And he's functionally a combat veteran. He had pretty bad PTSD. He went to the Veterans Administration asking for help. He was like, I have these nightmares. I feel like I'm back in the war. I can't sleep. He couldn't sleep for days and days and days because he was having these really intense flashbacks. Because he wasn't formally a veteran, the VA told him that they couldn't help him. And kind of as a result of this, and as a result of his trauma and a bunch of other factors, he ended up in trouble, and now he's in deportation proceedings. His whole family is back in Iraq. His dad is sick. He wants nothing more than to see them. He really misses them. But he's like, I can't go back. And he really can't, because he will be killed if he returns to his country. And so this isn't just like the most extreme example I can think of. This is a pretty common story. Not all of my clients are former combat interpreters, but I've had more than one. And I think it's a good example of, this is a person who is in this bind, right? He wants to go back home because he wants to be with his family and he loves his country. But doing that would be to give up his life. And it's not something that he is able or willing to do, and it's also not something that his family wants him to do.
Thank you very much, Jordan. So we'll leave it there. We're just about at 7:30. But I wanted to just very quickly also just cap it off by saying one way that we can certainly start to look toward a solution to this problem is by doing what we're doing here tonight. So thank you both, really, and thank you to all of you and to Sally Ann, for everyone for showing up. Again, if anybody wants to come to our future events, we have an event on October 5th regarding journalists and the government and our rights to information. On October 27th, we'll be doing a talk with Santa Clara University regarding voting rights, and it's just a week before the midterm, so that'll certainly be interesting to everybody. And on November 9th, we'll be doing a talk on political correctness, which I think is certainly a heated issue these days. If you want more information, you can visit us at our website, which is sbs.arizona.edu/UA-debate-series. And you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at UA Debate Series. And thank you everybody for showing up. And if anybody wants to speak and grill our speakers anymore, we're having a reception at Hermanos on 4th Avenue. If anybody would like to join us there, thank you very much.